Okay, welcome everyone. On behalf of Bryant's Alumni Association, welcome to our career webinar series, Communicating in Crisis Situations. Before I turn the program over to our presenters, I wanted to provide you with some tips for today's webinar. All participants will be muted. However, we encourage you to comment and ask questions using the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. We're joined today by 3 faculty members from Bryant University. Rick Gorvet is a professor and chair of the mathematics department at Bryant. He is a fellow of the Casualty Actuarial Society and a chartered enterprise risk analyst. His research and teaching interests involve actuarial science, risk management, and financial mathematics. Professor Chris Morse teaches in the Department of Communication. He teaches and researches risk and crisis communication, as well as how people seek information and manage uncertainty. He currently serves as editor-in-chief of Communication Research and also serves on the editorial boards for Nursing Communication and Communication Research Reports. Professor Julie Volkman teaches and researches health communication, focusing on health message design and the integration of health communication and health services research. She is currently the chair of the Health Communication Interest Group for the Eastern Communication Association. She is also a member of the Society of the Behavioral Medicine Scientific and Professional Liaison Council, working to create collaborations between health communication and behavioral medicine scholars and practitioners. Today's presentation will be handled by all 3 of our guests. Rick will start with a discussion of the origin of this work, as well as the issue of communicating complex information in less than ideal situations. Chris will then discuss the nature of crisis and how it impacts us as an audience. Finally, Julie will conclude with some applications designed to help address these issues. We will end the presentation with a Q&A session with all of our presenters. With that said, I'd like to start off by passing the presentation to Rick.
Well, before we really get started, we'd like to ask you to please take a moment to respond to 3 very quick polling questions. And there we go. The first asks about your particular area of work or study. The second, whether you have ever had to deal with communicating about a crisis. And if your answer is yes, we'd ask that you please take a moment to click on the chat button and tell us specifically what kind of problem you encountered. And then actually, if you could, before you do that, chat, if you could just quick answer the third question, simple yes or no about whether or not you've ever been responsible for delivering bad or unwanted information at work, or I suppose anywhere else, but we're going to tend to focus on work, and just give you a moment to do these. And I can see things coming in here. Looks good. Got maybe 12 or 14 responses so far. Pretty distributed. No science people? None? No technical or science people? Lots of business people. Several others, and looks like a little bit more than half of you have answered yes to the second question. So we'll be interested in seeing your specifics. If you can take a minute and chat about those, we'd appreciate it. And thank you. Yeah, it looks like we have business and finance wins, and marketing, advertising, and others seem to be the fairly close follow-ups. So certainly some of these categories are more typical, having crisis communication issues in them, and certainly healthcare is one of them that we're all familiar with recently. But of course, they can all, all of these can have issues associated with them. And so let's talk about this. This webinar really all began with a paper that the three of us wrote for a call for papers issued by the Casualty Actuarial Society. Specifically, it was a call for papers involving communication in an actuarial business setting. Now, you may not know a lot about what actuaries do, but you probably at least know it's a very technical profession. Basically, it involves the quantification of risk contingencies. These are things that might or might not happen, and that if they do happen, they could have a significant financial impact on someone or someone's or an organization. Contingencies like, for example, death, an automobile accident, a hurricane hitting a building, illness induced by a pandemic virus, apropos of nothing. Whatever the specific risk, the actuary uses mathematics, statistics, and financial techniques, and actually a whole lot of other things to measure the likelihood of such an event and its potential financial consequences. So actuarial science is very technical, and as a matter of fact, there's an entire series of professional exams that can take from 5 to 10 years for somebody to pass them all, study for each one, and generally you tend to take a couple per year. So this is a long-term thing, and I've got to say, almost every technical aspect of the job is covered by one or another of these actuarial exams. But, of course, there's no communications exam. There's no exam where you study how to communicate this technical information to others, either inside or outside your company, to people who generally don't have the same kind of technical background as you do. You don't share that background, and it's hard to talk between people without shared backgrounds, whatever that background is. But with an actuary, it's even worse than that, because actuaries very often are in a position to communicate results of technical information and techniques, yes, but very often those results are negative in some sense. They're bad or unexpected very often news associated with either a person or, more likely, with an actuary, an organization. For example, giving information about a company's solvency or financial situation to the company's executives or to the board of directors of the company. And as a consultant, I had to do that on several occasions. And it's really, it's tough emotionally, but it's also tough just from the standpoint of the basics of communicating. How do you approach something like that? How do you tell people who rely on an organization for their livelihood, and who are probably not at least fully expecting the results that you might have come out with? How do you tell them this? How do you communicate? What's the best way to get their attention, to ensure that they understand what you're saying? And again, it's from two perspectives. It's from the inherent technical nature of the material and of the techniques you use, but it's also the message that you're trying to send. And of course, actuaries are far from the only ones who deal in technical areas and have crisis situations to communicate about. Medical professionals, for example, often must talk to patients about unexpected illnesses or diagnoses. Architects and engineers sometimes need to warn people about risks or defects in products. And apropos, again, of our current environment, sometimes public health officials have to warn and advise the general public about dangers, for example, from a virus, and advice about how to respond and how to keep a distance and so forth. We've all become fairly familiar with that. So there are many different situations and contexts involving the communication and information that the audience might not expect or understand, or just plain not have the technical background to fully appreciate. And the audiences in such situations can vary a lot too. The doctor communicates generally to an individual. The actuary typically communicates within the organization, within the insurance company, or if the actuary is a consultant, to the client insurance company. The public health official communicates to the general public. And all of these situations can involve hugely challenging problems. And again, challenging with respect to communication, but also in many cases emotionally, both from the standpoint of the communicator, the technical expert, and the audience listening to or reading or somehow receiving this information. It can be challenging at a number of different levels and perspectives. So now I'd like to pass the baton to Chris to discuss what is it about us as human beings that makes communicating in these difficult situations so problematic. Chris?
Thanks, Rick. So as Rick mentioned, this presentation and the work that the three of us have done together really came about from the idea that, discussing technical information, whether actuarial, health, marketing, management, res life, politics, it doesn't matter. Information that's heavily jargoned, information that has a lot of quantitative aspects to it, et cetera, is difficult enough as itself. But doing this same thing in a situation where either there's a crisis going on and your audience is kind of experiencing this crisis and you're having to convey this information, or as Rick kind of mentioned, and as I see some of you have mentioned on the group chat, there are also situations where your discussion of communication of your information might cause the crisis or might create this kind of issue that causes all these problems, and which we're here to talk to you today about. So there's kind of two factors that we're kind of, asking you to think about, whether or not you're in the crisis situation and you're having to discuss this type of stuff, or whether or not your discussion of this will cause the crisis. They both kind of seem to have the same effect, or more importantly, they both have the same issue that you have to deal with. And so when we're talking about crisis communication, one of the things that a lot of the research and case studies and people who have worked in this area argue is that the major impact of crisis or crisis communication is uncertainty, right? And what I mean by uncertainty is, as a human being, we have overall a general desire to be able to predict and explain our surroundings, right? I know there's people out there who are like, oh, I like being surprised and I like spontaneity. And I'm not disagreeing with that, right? We all like, some people like, not knowing what's coming or not knowing what's going to happen in the movie or what their partner's going to do, et cetera, et cetera. But overall, that might take maybe 10% of your life, right? What the research argues is the other 90%, you like having a fair ability to predict and explain, right? When you go to work, you have a general idea of what your workday is going to be like. When you're driving to work, you know kind of what to expect regarding traffic. If you're sitting in a classroom, if you're talking to a client, if you're going out to dinner, right? We all have these general ideas of hey, this is how things are going to go. And that comforts us. It also helps us just kind of deal with stress and anxiety, right? The problem occurs when something comes along that interrupts that process, right? And so, we suddenly, something happened that we didn't see coming, we didn't anticipate, is completely out of the ordinary. And that thing could also lead to an inability of us to understand why it occurred. Every time you see something weird in your environment or something unexpected happens, you will probably most often find yourself trying to justify why that occurred, or why did that person do that, or why did that happen in the movie, or why did that coworker react the way they did, right? Our need to kind of explain it away so that we can kind of file it in our system so that next time we come to a similar situation, we are better able to predict and explain, is just a natural human behavior, right? And unfortunately, crisis situations disrupt this entire process, right? A crisis by its very nature causes us to suddenly question the world around us. It challenges the way we see things or do things. Suddenly, the world that had made sense before is turned upside down. In cases of, business or health, we are suddenly given information that makes us question whether we know what's going on or don't know what's going on and what's going to happen. And so we are trying to deal with this sudden challenge to our environment and our viewpoint of life. And it's that challenge which presents the biggest difficulty for us as communicators when dealing with our audience in crisis situations. And so what we kind of wanted to highlight is how people who are experiencing this uncertainty, like I said, either because they're in a crisis situation or you presented them with some information that suddenly threw them into this crisis situation. We wanted to talk to you about how these people change. And it's really important because one of the biggest mistakes in this kind of field or this area is talking to your audience the same way you always talk to them, right? Thinking that if I talk slower or longer or just give more examples, I'll be able to get through this, they'll understand this, they'll take away what I want them to take away with. Treating them like you do every day is the biggest mistake. And the reason why it's a big mistake, and we'll talk about it here in the next couple slides, is that human beings, when put in this situation, alter some of the things they do. They almost become a different person. And if you don't think about that and you don't kind of compensate for that, you're going to really kind of, if you want to say, miss the mark in how you're communicating or interacting with your information, and you're not going to get the results that you kind of want to do. So to highlight some of the major changes that happen in this type of situation, the next slide highlights the kind of big ones that pop out in the literature. So to kind of give you an example here, one of the big things that happens when people get into this uncertainty or crisis situation is the way they process or think about information differs, right? Or their comprehension level differs. And what I mean by that is, this heightened uncertainty or this inability to predict and explain kind of puts us in panic mode. And I'm speaking of us as the audience, right? And so because we're in this panic mode, we tend to get overstimulated with everything that's going on. There's, emotional states that we're currently feeling. There's somebody talking to us about what's going on. There's stuff happening in our environment. We're thinking about possible scenarios of what might be happening in the future and how this affects us. And so that overload causes us to simplify messages as kind of a fail-safe for a way to protect ourselves. And what I mean by simplify messages is people will strip down what they hear. They will jump to conclusions. If they start to hear somebody talking to them and they think, oh, I know what they're going to say, they'll jump to that conclusion and kind of answer based on how they feel that people will respond. If you as the speaker have a lot of technical information, they might not get all that. They might hear the first or the second and then just stop right there. Sometimes they'll hear the first thing and that's kind of what they'll get stuck on. They'll misrepresent what your instructions were, because if the instructions are too complex, they're going to simplify them to try and make more sense of themselves. And the problem is when we simplify stuff, we sometimes edit out the important things. Right? So one of the things is we definitely alter our comprehension, right? Another thing is we alter the value that we place on information. And so alluding to what I mentioned a little bit before, what we hear first is of great importance. And I mean we as the audience in a crisis situation, right? We tend to put great weight on the first message. And this is everything from the first thing we hear about this crisis to the first thing we actually hear in the person talking about this crisis, right? And so, Julie will talk later about some issues and some things with this, but one of the things, if you are somebody who is delivering information that's going to throw somebody in the crisis, they might hear the first 2 or 3 sentences you say, and then that's all they hear, okay? Not only are they simplifying it, that's what they're believing, and that's it, right? Another thing that might be problematic is the fact that if you are somebody who doesn't deal with the crisis or you let other people do the talking, you are going to be constantly having to play catch up in the sense that your audience is going to listen to what the first thing they hear is, and everything else is going to get measured to that first thing, right? This is how I hear the situation. Now you're coming along and telling me something different. Well, unless your information is more credible or it makes more sense compared to what I first heard, I'm just going to stick with the first thing I heard, right? And that can be potentially dangerous for us as the people who are trying to communicate this information to our audiences and trying to help them or warn them or comfort them or offer support or things of that nature, right? Another thing is that people tend to cope a little bit differently when it comes to crisis situations. And the way I've always thought about this is a turtle kind of pulling back into its shell, right? When people are presented with things that they don't want to hear, or they are in a situation that is highly uncertainty inducing, right? They kind of revert to their safe zone or their safe spot, right? The things that they believe down to their core or their most central values, they'll kind of go with those, almost like they're going on default, right? So if you are asking somebody to do something, or if you are asking somebody or instructing somebody how to handle something, they might do what you're asking, or because in their situation, they might not even listen to you and think, okay, last time I was in something like this, I did this, so I'm just going to do that again. And the problem with that is a lot of times it might not be the right, correct information. Something that constantly comes up in dealing in risk and crisis situations is with environmental disasters, where when people are presented that they should be evacuating their homes, or there's a hurricane or a flood coming, right, and they need to kind of leave their place of residence, some people will sit there and say, well, the last time we had a real bad storm, I just hid in my bathtub and everything worked out okay, so that's what I'm going to do this time. Right? And so despite you as the person giving the information, giving great detail and giving great justification, you might have to consider the fact that it's going to take a little bit more work, because people like to do what's comfortable to them. People like to do what they feel has helped them in the past. And a lot of times that's not going to be what you want them to do, right? The last big thing that alters people is that they have an increased need to seek information from other sources. Now, this seems to kind of contradict what I said earlier about people placing great weight on the first thing that they hear, right? That's still true. The first thing I hear is the thing that everything else is going to get measured up against. Right? But what I do is I then go and find other people. I ask my neighbors, have you heard about this? If I'm at a work, okay, and I was just given some horrible information, I might go to coworkers, or if I'm a manager, go to other managers and ask, have you heard this? No? Well, then maybe it's not really occurring, right? I'll go to social media. I'll try and look for different news sources. I'll go to different news channels. I'll, here you are, maybe you're in actuarial and you're talking to me. I don't like what you have to say. I'm going to go try and find another person in your department to talk to and see if they have the same information, right? We don't just, even if people like you, even if people think you're credible, even if people trust you, if they have a history of buying into what you've said, when they're put in a crisis situation, they won't just rest with your say-so. They will constantly be trying to check up on others or other sources of information. Part of this is just to confirm, but part of this is also, if they don't like what you're saying, they're trying to find a source that tells them something that they want to hear, and then be like, okay, well, I'm going to go with that. Okay. The issue with all of these things is human beings don't normally do this to this extent, okay, unless they're in a crisis situation. And so we oftentimes overestimate our ability to talk to people, technical information or even non-technical information in these type of situations, right? We treat them, I'm a really good manager, or I'm a really good doctor, or I'm a really good res life or a politician. I connect with people all the time. So, this is just another example of something bad, but I can still do this. Okay? If you try the same old, you're going to fail. Right? Because these people that you're talking to, as I just mentioned, they're shifting, right? This situation is causing them to act differently, right? and you have to adapt the way you're talking to match this change in them to be more effective, right? And the problem remember, we talked about all this is occurring because they have a lack of ability to predict and explain their environment. Something's happened, or you've given them some information that's thrown their whole world upside down. Right? People do these actions I just mentioned as a way of trying to compensate. And so if you can match this, it greatly helps them, right? But if you don't, as the last point in the slide says, it gets to be really problematic. And that is uncertainty unchecked rolls into fear. And fear has several problematic situations to it with your audience. If your audience is experiencing high levels of fear, the fight or flight response starts to kick in. A lot of people have argued they get even less rational. They are now just looking for a way out. They don't want to think about something. They don't want to deal with the problems. They'll do the first quick solution that they can come up with to hopefully get them out of this situation. It doesn't help you as the person trying to convey information and hopefully either help the company, help the organization, help the department, help the individual, et cetera, et cetera. If fear continues and goes unchecked, it has actually led to something called helplessness and hopelessness. And this is extremely dangerous for you as somebody conveying information to an audience. If your audience gets to this state, okay, it's very hard to motivate them to process information or to even alter their behaviors, because at this stage, they figured they're doomed. No matter what we do, everything's gonna fail, everything's gonna blow up, the company's done, people are tanked, the organization is in a tailspin that it can't get out of. So you know what? I might as well just sit here and do nothing, because nothing I'm going to do is mattering. And that really causes huge problems. And as you can probably think about in your work or in examples that you've experienced, it's very hard to move those people to not only help the situation, but to help themselves. And so we never really want to get people to this situation. So the idea here is we need to figure out some ways of altering our tactics to compensate for the way people are thinking. So part of the battle is knowing how people are thinking and how they change and being able to compensate for that. And the other part is engaging in certain types of tweaks to our behavior or the way we communicate that can kind of play into this. And to discuss that, Julie's going to take over and discuss those type of things.
Great, thanks, Chris. Appreciate it. So some of what I wanted to talk about was a little bit of an extension of what Chris had been talking about, our audience and how they're changing and processing things a little differently. I know from our poll that a lot of you have experience in delivering crisis information, and some of you in your chat I saw pop up that it's been very acute health crisis moments that have occurred and something that maybe you weren't even prepared for. So in some circumstances we're talking about a crisis that, you know, maybe you've asked to be evaluated and see what is our likelihood of this event happening. Other times crises are things that are out of your control, things you didn't think will be happening. And so some of these tips are coming from language about health communication, even some things about health literacy. If you're not familiar with the CDC, they have a wealth of resources on risk communication, specifically a manual called the Crisis and Emergency Risk Communication Manual, or CERC, C-E-R-C manual, that's sometimes helpful. What I find valuable is a lot of times organizations will take a moment to reflect back on how they've done with risk communication or crisis communication plans. I've noticed that a couple organizations like the CDC have done webinars or summits, and they've made them available on YouTube. So if you have a moment to search that out, you might find some additional tips that could be pertinent to the types of crises that you are communicating about. Another one that I have found to be really helpful, and one that I share with my students when I'm teaching, is one about the Boston Marathon bombing. And it's a reflection on how media relations occurred, what went well, what they tried to do in the moment to balance both local media coverage and satisfying local media reporters' desire for information, as well as national news, as well as realizing that a lot of information was being put forth on social media, and it gave them some significant lessons learned. Also, unfortunately, the shootings that have happened on college campuses, that has also given us different opportunities to realize what has worked well and not worked well. So some of the tips that I'm going to share with you are very generalized in a sense. For preparing this presentation, we weren't sure what specific areas people might need guidance. So hopefully those few things that I just mentioned would give you some supplemental information. So Jessica, you can go to the next slide now. Great. Thank you. So I think from what Rick and Chris have been talking about cannot be emphasized anymore about the avoidance of jargon. This is something that we talk extensively about in health communication, also in risk communication. You cannot assume that your audience knows everything that you're going to be talking about. I've been listening to a lot of different webinars now that we're all quarantined at home. It seems I have more time to go to these webinars for professional development. And, you know, they're giving presentations and they're assuming the audience knows things like what is an odds ratio, what is a p-value, you know, what are these technological terms, and you cannot assume that. Even simple things that we know in health comm, when a doctor is talking to a patient, to not say things like oral. When it comes to medication, you have to say by mouth. And actually, if you'll notice, prescription labels now will say take one pill by mouth, because oral can be confusing for people. Saying what a referral means, a referral is too complex. Instead, you say, go talk to another doctor, go get a second opinion. Even thinking about benign, what that word means, instead saying will not cause harm. So it cannot be, you know, thought of more than to really not, I would say, dumb down, but to really simplify the language that you're trying to communicate to people so that they're easy to follow. And in fact, even if you want to think about actionable things that people can concretely hang their mind about. I'm sorry, you have my daughter in the background. She ignored my, this must be an emergency. You're gonna have to wait, Gabriella, I'm giving a talk. I'm sorry, Gabriella, you're gonna have to wait, giving a talk. You have to think about tips from health literacy too. So if you're interested, there's quite a few resources about how we can communicate complex information in a way that people can make the best health decision for themselves. And so some of that is in how you present information with bulleted. Sometimes you present information in narrative form with a story or a personal experience. And so those are some additional tips. There was a question prior to this talk about how to communicate sensitive information. And I think that might have been referencing some of the chat moments here where acute situations happened. And so Rick, Chris, and I were trying to think about how to best answer that. And in certain businesses and circumstances, I'm sure you probably are aware of policies and circumstances and what you cannot communicate. In situations as a professor, when there's a mental health crisis, I'm having a role where I have to communicate a crisis moment to somebody and disclose that information. There's other instances where I serve as an advocate, and in those instances, there's a little bit more of confidential information. So if that person is here, I would love for them to elaborate on that question a little bit more in chat, so that way Chris, Rick, and I can further elaborate on communicating sensitive information. The other tip that I think Chris had really emphasized as well is to consider the order of the presentation, the information you are presenting. As you know, usually the first things that you hear about are the ones you hang your hat on, the ones that you start to mull over in your head. You know, if there's a statement said of, you know, think about the COVID vaccine, you know, this is a problem that might have to be thought of as not as this fall, but 5 years out. Now, if someone says that sentence, that's the sentence that you're going to listen to, and everything after that, what that person says, you're not going to listen to. So you have to think about what's the most important information to get across first, because that's the thing that people are going to be processing. We know this in bad news delivery for training healthcare providers when they have to give a diagnosis, that there's times where people are really struggling and understanding a crisis diagnosis such as cancer, and so they don't understand, and that's why they now suggest you have a partner, a loved one, someone to support you that can also listen for the information. The other thing to think about is to not speculate and to be transparent, but also gather feedback as you're presenting information. So that way you're constantly being able to address any myths or misconceptions, help alleviate any fear from starting. This is not the time, as you probably all are well aware, to speculate. You don't guess, you don't guesstimate, you don't shoot from the hip, you don't try and be humorous. All of those things are not an ideal part right now in crisis communication. The other thing that's interesting is how to repeat your information in a way and be timely with your information. So the literature actually does support the repetition of 3 times. That is a way that people can remember information, but also not feel annoyed by getting it repetitive information to them. And also, when being timely with your information, try and make sure people know that you are working on answers, even if you don't have all the answers. I think that was one of the lessons that we learned in previous crisis moments. One of the iconic ones has been the Tylenol pill bottle, where they didn't know why, but they communicated very clearly what they were going to do to try and figure out what happened. And so that was something that was considered, get the information out quickly, address any concerns that are happening from other sources of information. So in this day and age of social media, it is important to think about what other information people are obtaining, but not because they're seeking out that information, because it's being presented to them as they're scanning from other information. So those are some of the things to think about, the timely and repetitiveness of your information. The other thing I'd like to address, it's not here on a bullet, but just something that Chris had mentioned, I thought would just reiterate again. We as human beings, we value the certainty in our everyday lives. We like to know that this is how it's supposed to go. We need to know about how we act in an elevator, how we're supposed to begin a conversation. All of these are considered in the communication literature as scripts. And so in crisis communication, it's important to not come in with a set script, because your audience will be thinking about things in a different way, and you're going to have to address the needs of your audience in the moment. And so having a set script is not an ideal way to go. Try and think about how you can adapt your message and be timely. Now, that being said, I know all of us marketing folks, I have an undergrad in marketing and advertising and PR, would say, there's always key messaging that we're trying to develop. And I'm not saying you stay away from the key messaging. And someone just put in a chat, we never should lie. That's true too. Always be truthful. But you can't go in and say, I'm going to talk about this, and I'm going to talk about this, and I'm going to talk about this. You can clearly see if your audience is getting confused, if your audience is starting to get unaware, or being very confused and not understanding what's happening. You adapt your message accordingly. So I think that that's really important, is to not always revert to the old technique and the old way that you address people. And then when you're addressing information from multiple points, do consider some of the things that we come from health literacy. And those are things related to multiple formats of sending your information, the cultural appropriateness of your information, and how you focus on specific actions for people to do. So I think one of the things that the COVID-19 crisis communication focused on very early was, what can you do? And so unfortunately, as things came around, those what can you do moments became, I'm unsure what to do with these. So it was first, wear a mask, wear gloves. And then as time went on, people are not wearing the gloves, and people found out that the masks really aren't going to prevent COVID-19. It's going to, lessen the ability for your germs to be passed on to another person. But, testing, and that's seen to be the most actionable thing to do. But altogether, though, I think those ideas from health literacy are helpful in crisis communication moments, where we try and address in multiple ways, because you recognize an audience, especially if you have a public audience, they quite frankly might not have the literacy levels of that are quite high. Actually, a lot of times in health communication, we say our reading levels need to be around a 5th grade reading level to meet all other people. And then cultural appropriateness as well. Depending on the crisis situation, there's different social norms, there's different, regional, local considerations that need to be taken into account. So what worked well in one town might not work well in another town. And so I would also just end in saying that every time that you can, be upfront, as many of you know, and I've seen pop up in the chat section, about giving the information, saying what you don't know, but then answering questions as best as you can to acknowledge that those questions have come, because you are trying to prevent your audience from getting to that level of fear, and that leads to helplessness and hopelessness. You really want to try and avoid that. And again, I know that a lot of you have experience in doing this, so I would love to hear some of your tips. I've seen some things move around in the chat section, so I'd love to explore that a little bit more. But these are just some general tips that hopefully are things maybe you've not thought of. Maybe if they are things you've thought of, you know, you're doing, you know, and from the literature, the right thing to do. This is definitely one of those areas of communication that can be the most difficult areas to deal with. There's a lot of things that we do poorly, and we learn our lessons and move on from previous experiences, and hopefully we'll get it right sometime. So with that, I think I'll move it on to Q&A, and I'm going to take a moment to ask my daughter to stop talking, so I apologize if you've heard her. So Jessica, would you mind looking at the chat and seeing if there's any general question that can be tossed to the Chris, Rick, and I?
Yeah, of course. So
Great, thank you.
It looks like the one question we had from earlier, Chris was starting to answer in the chat. So the question was, how do you balance that transparency with protecting sensitive information? And so, Julie, I don't know if you want to go into that, or Chris, if you want to kind of go over what you were writing in the chat.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to type fast, and I'm not a fast typer, so that was a dangerous combination. But no, it's a George, it's a great question, and you know, you mentioned that you're military, so I'm sure it's even bigger issues in some of the cases. Yeah, when we've talked to people, or based on research has been done in case studies and stuff like that, there's lots of organizations and instances where part of the crisis or some of the crisis involves highly sensitive information that for whatever reason, the company, either because of their own policies or because of, for example, HIPAA guidelines or various other things, they can't, you can't disclose. And the biggest mistake that has been made consistently in these type of situations is the organization or the individual ignores the request for information or ignores people talking about the situation. Doesn't even address it, doesn't even answer any questions, pretends it's not even there. And so what I was meaning by the honesty and transparency is some people conflate the two in the sense that in order to be honest, I have to be transparent. And that's not actually true, right? There are times in crisis situations, Julie brought up the Boston Marathon bombing, which has been it sounds weird to say, a great example of crisis management in the sense that in early ongoing, the press and the public were asking questions that the police force didn't know the answers to. And one of the things they did not do is they didn't give opinions or make up information, right? Because that always comes back to hurt you later on once people start figuring stuff out. They were completely honest in saying, we don't know that answer right now. We are investigating it, and when we have an answer, we will make sure to talk to you or disclose it to you if you could just give us some more time, right? And that at least let the audience know that, you know, it builds up that honesty thing, because you're admitting you don't know something, right? Which sometimes we know that you don't know it, but we're asking you for comfort, and when you start making up stuff, it starts to feel dishonest and it causes a whole kind of issue, right? It also let the audience know that they heard the question, and to the best of their ability, they're trying to give the answer that they have now, right? The third thing it did also was, remember when we were talking about earlier, that people will go and try and find other sources of information, right? If I didn't even acknowledge the question, people wouldn't stop asking the question, they just go to another source. This way, I at least acknowledge the question and say, we're gonna have an answer, come back and kind of stick with me for it, right? when we also include the idea of sensitive information, there are times in definitely some legal issues. One that comes to mind is an issue with the Australian military a couple years ago regarding some things that they were having going on with some of their officers. People wanted to know answers. They wanted to know what was happening. They wanted to know who was guilty, things of that nature. And the person in charge says, you know, due to legal reasons, I can't disclose this information to you. Here's what I can tell you. And on they went and talked about it. Or they said, at this time, until court proceedings are over with, I can't discuss this. Here's what I can discuss. When I'm allowed to talk about this, I will. Other situations have been, you know, due to the strict privacy laws, things of that nature, we can't discuss this. Now, you might take a hit for that, right? Because now the policies are going to start to become attacked. But in the long run, in a crisis situation, acknowledging that you can't talk about it or there's a reason why we can't discuss this helps out more than just ignoring the question or downplaying it or completely acting like it didn't happen. So being transparent, not being transparent doesn't mean you can't be honest. And so that's what I was trying to convey in that type of information. So I hope that helps answer. It was a long-winded answer. I apologize.
Perfect. Thank you. We do have a couple other questions in the chat. So again, if anyone in the audience has some questions, feel free to enter those into the chat feature. One of them was, how do we balance kindness and the flowery language with the need to communicate relevant information? Does it ever get old or irritating for the audience, particularly when it's as ongoing as this current pandemic?
That's a really interesting question. You know, it's the kindness. Ooh, it's a tough one. You know, what's interesting with this particular pandemic is that I'm actually seeing more emphasis on the kindness and the compassion as information to convey, along with the scientific information being conveyed. So I feel that the kindness and flowery language will always be appreciated, but I think it does not replace honest and upfront information that is clear and actionable for people to take and to understand that this is the latest information that you are providing for me. I'll let Chris elaborate a little bit more, but that's from my viewpoint and understanding you know, how doctors can communicate bad news to a patient, and that's my viewpoint from health communication. I do more health communication than risk communication, and kindness and compassion is always, you know, appreciated and wanted. But and the truth of it is, tell me what's going on with my body and what our plan is, and what we can discuss to move forward. But Chris, I'll let you answer that too.
Yeah, no, it's a really great question, and as Julie mentioned, you know, it's always important that the delivery of information, whether it's about the pandemic or health or anything else, you know, you're attempting to try and connect with this person. And we just talked about how they're operating under a different set of rules temporarily. So, you know, politeness, and if you're calling it flowery language, does have a place in making the information easier to digest, if you want to say it that way. Right? The danger becomes, though, when the flowery language starts competing or overtaking the facts, right? I mean, the real reason why you're talking to them is to give them actual, actionable information. And so if you're giving them that information and putting some flowery language on it to help it kind of be a little bit easier to understand or to take, that's wonderful. When the flowery language starts just filling space and it's getting less and less about facts and less about information, that's when you get into a real danger that you start seeming less genuine, less trustworthy. And I think that's where the annoyance that people have start coming in, right? I'm happy that you're talking nice to me and you're giving me soft blows about the information, or you're trying to couch it in a way to let me down easy, as long as you're giving me information that needs to be let down easy. If there's nothing there behind that flowery language, that's when you're running into problems and annoyances and things like that. I did want to, while I'm talking, jump to another question here. Somebody mentioned the fact that one of their challenges is that they're dealing with highly intelligent people whose work is complex, and that while you don't understand why they're not understanding because they seem to be smarter than you are. I would go back to the idea here of the way people process information that either puts them in a crisis or processes information while they're in a crisis, right? They could, one of the big interesting things about uncertainty and crisis is it knows no bounds regarding intelligence, right? Even the most intelligent person will start to simplify messages, will start to revert back to tried and true mechanisms, will look for opposite opinions, right? Just because they're smarter doesn't mean they can kind of defend against this. So it might be, you might actually be dealing with highly intelligent people, but I would argue if it's around this type of situation, they are just as susceptible to not wanting to hear certain things or starting to be, getting into the high levels of uncertainty and fear, which is causing them to simplify things or, play stupid, if that's what you want to kind of call it as. And so you might be getting frustrated because you understand this stuff. You're the one that taught me this stuff. You're the one that gave me this information. But then when it gets flipped back on them, they suddenly don't get it. It's because of this stuff that we were mentioning in this presentation. The way that they are processing and dealing with things is altering